Welcome back to another episode of Learning Vue.js the Hard Way, the video series where we are learning Vue.js by reading through the manual. And in the last few episodes, we've been talking about class and style bindings, or more specifically, we've actually been talking about class bindings, and maybe in this video we'll actually get to style bindings as well. So the point here is that we are, or in the last videos, we've essentially then been talking about getting CSS into your rendered HTML, or that was a very unspecific way of saying it. What I mean is, when we've talked about classes, is how can you put CSS classes onto your HTML elements reactively, right? I mean, you can always just take an element and then add the class attribute and then add a class to it, right? But of course, what we would rather do is that we would rather bind that, or when we're using Vue, we would rather bind these classes so that they show up reactively. Or, I mean, I shouldn't say rather. If we want to have them reactive, then we can do it using Vue.js. So that's essentially what we've been talking about. And we've talked about then HTML. We've talked about binding classes, and today we might get into inline styles, but we haven't talked yet about components, right? We've talked about the object syntax and the array syntax, but we haven't talked about components. And so, just a quick recap. I mean, object syntax is for saying that every key in an object is specifying a class name, and then every value that key points to or corresponds to determines whether that key should be rendered, should be outputted into the element that you're rendering or not, right? So let's try to think about that in a more general way. So the object syntax is for conditionally rendering a known CSS class, right? That's kind of a way we should think about it, or a way we could think about it. The array syntax, however, is to sort of add multiple to render multiple classes based on values inside variables, right? So rendering a CSS class based on let's say whose name is unknown, right? Where the thing behind the variable decides the name, but it's not just the name. It could also be that what hides behind that variable, or that expression that you're evaluating. That thing could be another object. So you could put objects following the object syntax as items in an array. But again, like this is just a quick recap. If that doesn't make any sense to you, please do check out the last two videos where we talked about that. So let me just jump into the folder that we're working with here. I just forgot that. Okay, so as usual, we have these two files. We have an index.html file and we have a main.js file. Okay, now let's dive into it. So the section that we're going to talk about is components. Wait, let me just see. I got to figure out what my cat is doing. All good. We're good to go. Okay, so so we're gonna talk about components, and I think this is an interesting note here in the beginning, right? They're saying that this section assumes knowledge of Vue components, and Vue components here is a link so that you can jump to that section. Feel free to skip it and come back later. So what they're essentially saying is that if you don't know how Vue components work, then you shouldn't necessarily read this section. You can skip this section and then first read about Vue components, or whenever you've read about Vue components, you can then come back and read this section. So I think we're going to skip that and just read ahead, right? Because we've kind of talked a lot about components last time we talked about components, right? I mean, let's go to the table of contents here. I mean, I think somewhere, it doesn't say explicitly, but I think maybe in the introduction or the Vue instance, there was some talk around components, right? And we've talked about it a bit, and we've been thinking about it a bit, so I think we should be able to get through fine here, right? And if not, then let's just come back to this section after we've read Vue components. But let's try this out anyways, right? So what are they saying here, right? It seems to me spontaneously that what they're saying is that components essentially work the same way as they do when you have regular elements. So if you have a component and you bind to the class attribute of that component, then that just means that you'll add classes to that component, right? Like as we were doing before. So I mean, let's just jump into Vim here and let's open up the index.html file. So do we have a component here? Yes, we have this cart item that we've been working with before. By the way, let me just say very quickly, I realize that this code has become somewhat of a catastrophic mess. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that we get through this section, like the class and style binding section. And then before we jump into the next one, conditional rendering, we're actually going to sort of just scratch this application and rewrite or actually not rewrite, just like take what we've learned so far and rewrite a new application or write a new application that's just a basic to-do list, right? Because I think we're sort of, yeah, it's becoming a bit hard to reason about what's going on because it's like we just have such a mess of code. But let's at least finish the CSS section and then we'll do that before we jump into conditional rendering. If you want me to do that earlier, let me know, but maybe, yeah, we'll see if we actually manage to finish this section today. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, so do we have a component here? Yes, we have the cart item here, right? So cart item is a component, and that cart item component is defined here in main.js, right? View component, cart item, that's where we registered it. And it takes some props, right? That the property that it takes is a single item because the cart item component displays a single cart item, and then the template here for that cart item is that we essentially just have a list element, and in that we are rendering the amount and then the string pieces of concatenated with the name of that particular cart item, right? Let's open up this this index.html file in the browser so we can see what's going on. What happened? Oops, my bad. Sorry, I opened up the the main.js file. I meant, so Sublime was open accidentally. I meant to open up this index.html file. So let me just open up that. Let me bump up this font size, and let's think about. Okay, so the cats are going crazy. I have to sort this out. Meanwhile, maybe think about, so here's the component, right? Think about how we could bind classes to that component, right? Using v-bind. Hang on. So it's the same thing, right? Let me just check that I didn't mess anything up here. No, all good. So it's the same thing, right? I mean, if we want to bind a class, let's actually see if they did it. Wait, hang on. Notice how we're actually rendering the template now. There seems to be a syntax error. So let's sort that out. Let's open up the console here. We can see, okay, let me make the font size bigger. We can see, okay, unexpected token, and then this sort of curly brace. So that has to be in the main.js file, and that's probably because I've missed a comma. I happen to remember this from last time. Yep, here. So here we've missed a comma. So let me just save that and refresh. Yeah, sorry, that was just, it was a syntax error trailing from the last episode, right? That I forgot to fix when I exited the editor last time, right? So okay, let's close that. But that actually puts me on an interesting side note. So I can't remember who, but somebody in the comment section in the last video made the great comment that there's this strange behavior. If you notice now how when I refresh this page, you can see that the sort of the template temporarily is showing, right? You can see here up in the first text, you can see that it says sort of curly brace, full name, and then closing curly brace and curly brace before it actually outputs the actual data. And I tried to answer that comment in kind of detail. So if you want to have more details, have a look at that comment maybe. But essentially what's going on is that this is a great question, right? It's like, of course, this is not wanted, right? We don't really want this behavior. The reason this happens is that if you look at index.html, we are rendering our application, we are rendering our main Vue instance into this element called app. And the template for this let's say main component, the main Vue instance, the template for that is just put directly into app here. However, as we've talked about in a previous episode, what you can do is you can choose to either specify a template through the template property of a Vue component, or you can specify it as sort of HTML. And if you specify it as HTML, if you think about that, right, that means that the browser will, before the main.js Vue file has been loaded, before like the library Vue has been loaded, the browser will be given this template, right? This index.html file is just any old HTML file, right? I think actually, can I turn off JavaScript? I guess I would be able to turn off JavaScript somewhere here. If we go to maybe settings here, log, blah, 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 oh, blah. Okay, probably I can do it somehow, but let's not think about that now, right? Yeah, settings is probably the same settings. No, here, yeah, enable JavaScript. Yikes, my font size is way too big. I don't even know what that says. Okay, let me try to make the font size a bit smaller. Okay, like that, and then set the, where did I have it? Here? No, I must have had it here. Settings, sorry. Enable JavaScript source maps. No, that's not what we were looking for. Blah, 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 blah. Disable JavaScript, yes. Okay, no, debugger. Well, let's try that. Okay, and then let's refresh. Yes, exactly, right? So now I've disabled JavaScript. Oh, yeah, it just only worked once. That is so annoying. Okay, let's do that again. Settings, disable JavaScript, please. Disable JavaScript. And if I refresh now, right, we're loading the page without having JavaScript loaded, or without loading any JavaScript. And if I do that, that means I just get the HTML and no JavaScript. And of course, this is the HTML that we get because like we've specified the template directly here, right? And in that template, we've used this sort of mustache syntax. So of course, then that means that that's what's going to be rendered until the JavaScript file here in the end, right? Until main Vue is loaded and then main.js is loaded, right? Because first we need the Vue library, and then we need our own Vue, our own main.js file. Whoops, our own main.js file that says, here's my Vue instance, right? I'm constructing this Vue instance, and I want to render into, or I want to mount into the element that has the ID app, right? So not until we sort of hit that point, we can start to enter the Vue lifecycle. And the lifecycle we've talked about in a previous episode. You remember that nice image that they've presented in documentation. So not until this point do we have can we enter the Vue lifecycle, and hence can we ever reach the point where we will replace the sort of template stuff with the actual contents of our data model, right? Which is sort of when the rendering can happen. Okay, but anyways, let's enable JavaScript again, and let's close the console, and let's just refresh. Okay, so hopefully that sort of sorts things out a bit in regards to why this happens, right? So if I wanted to get rid of that, we could put the template in directly under a template here, right? I would put a template property here in the options object that's being passed to my Vue instantiation of Vue, and I'll just put that here as a string, right? The whole template, as opposed to having it specified directly here in the HTML. And again, when we get to the rewriting, when we rewrite this as a to-do application, then we'll do that, right? We will try to keep everything as components, and then we'll specify things as templates rather than using HTML like this, because of the unfortunate, let's say, behavior, right? The unfortunate behavior that you temporarily get to see the template before the JavaScript has loaded and before the let's say component has actually been rendered by Vue, right? Which is, I mean, in some sense inevitable, right? If you do it this way, you have to specify it. You have to specify the HTML in the Vue end if Vue is not supposed to see it, unless of course you do something where it's like, well, it's hidden by default or something like that, like you inline some style sheet that hides the whole thing by default, and then Vue enables it. But whatever, I mean, maybe it just makes sense to put it in JavaScript. Anyways, okay, let's move forward to what we were actually going to talk about. So where were we? So we were talking about Vue components, right? And we were going to say, well, how do you add a class to a component? Well, yeah, I mean, here they're just saying that, okay, if you add the class statement to a component, like the regular old, just a normal class, let's say we had a class, right? Like we have the party class. Wait, is the text red already? Let's just check this. and no. But if we set party mode to true, then each of these items will be red. So actually, let me do this. Let's add another class in our sort of inline style sheet, and let's no, not text, and let's say that that's important. And then we will say that that has a text decoration, which is underline. Yeah, so I realize that's the same thing as being a title, but semantically these things are different. So let's keep it that way. So this means that, I mean, if I just refresh now, of course that makes no difference, right? Because it's just CSS. But I mean, it's just we're just declaring another CSS class. But if I now add the attribute class to our cart item component, not to the component, right? But let's say an instance of the component, or the fact that we're specifying an instance. It's not really an instance, right? Because it's like we're saying that the cart item should be rendered for every fruit in fruits, right? So because we also have this v4. So like if we didn't say v4, then this would be one particular instance. But now it's more like a set of instances, because we're not a set, but like a list of instances, because we're looping through the every fruit in the list of fruits, and then we are rendering this cart item component for every fruit. But if I just add a class here, and let's just say important, and then let's refresh. Yeah, okay, sorry, we already did this. Then you can see it's underlined, right? Actually, wait. Was it underlined from the beginning? Did I? Yeah, okay. So how interesting. So I probably added the important class sometime in the last episode when just experimenting with a bunch of different stuff. So the UL, yeah, cart item style. Sorry, so let's go to main.js, cart item style. Right, so this is what we were messing around with last time, where we were saying that, okay, the party style is rendered conditionally, and then we always render the important class. But let's just remove this stuff from last time, right? So if I remove that, and then in the index.html, I'll remove yep, this from the UL. Yep, like that. I'll remove the style binding, and then we will refresh. I think we don't have any warnings or errors, right? Nope. I mean, we have a warning here, but this is in regards to a different thing. So, okay, so that means we are no longer tacking on that class, and so hence it's not underlined, right? So if I now, I mean, notice that before we had the important class on the UL element, but now we can add it on the cart item component. So let me just say class here. So if I say class, and then I'll say important, and then save that and refresh, then you can see it's underlined. So I mean, what they're emphasizing is just that you can, like if you specify components, then you can use class, like you can use the class attribute as normal. But I would actually, I mean, I would guess, let's just try this. If I add the element foobar, which is not a component and which is obviously not an HTML element, is that rendered? Yeah, here we have the foobar element, but then we also have an error here. So let's see what the error is, or it's a warning, right? So they're saying, okay, well, you're using this component foobar. Did you actually register this? Of course we didn't, right? We just made this up on the fly. But yeah, so this is a pretty poor test. What I wanted to test is actually let's test that. Let's do this. So let's open another file. Let's just copy all of this stuff. Let's open another file and call it test.html. I'll paste in the same stuff just to get a sort of scaffold HTML page. I'll remove all the contents here, right? So we have this very, very empty file, no styles, title. Let's just put test in here, right? So you can see now this is sort of an empty HTML file, right? What I wanted to test is that, let's say test file, like that. Let's just actually begin by opening that up so we know that we have that. Okay, so here's that test file. Okay, we've opened it. Can I now put an element, let's say foobar, and then let's say hello world foobar. I'll put that inside the foobar element. Like I would assume that this renders, right? This renders. Like in some sense, this is valid. I guess this is valid HTML5 because you can make up any attributes and any elements that you want. So so yeah, I mean that's totally fine. So what we can do is then I guess we can add a class attribute to that, right? So let's say test class, right? Let's save that. Yeah, and then it renders, right? Because also I assume like in a HTML5 you can add any attribute that you want, like la 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 points to the value lu, right? Doesn't make any sense, but whatever. Right? Let's save. Yeah, I mean that works. So what I'm emphasizing is that okay, let's remove this file. Remove this file, and then let's go back to index.html. Okay. Let's close this test file. So what I was emphasizing there is like, actually this is a good pause for a reflection. If you didn't, okay, sometimes I tend to say we had a hypothesis and then we tested the hypothesis and then we sort of concluded that our assumption was true, or we concluded that we can't conclude that our assumption is true. I think that's generally maybe if you're an experienced programmer, never mind. I mean, you already know this, but I think generally it makes sense to approach problems in that sense, right? When you're wondering about something, ask yourself, okay, well, what's my assumption, right? Try to make an assumption about how the system that you're dealing with actually works, right? Whether that's like a library or a language or like a concept or a calculation or a function or like whatever, right? Like make an assumption about the expected behavior. It's like, okay, I think the thing behaves in this manner, and then construct a small test that would either reject or what is the opposite of reject, right? Like validate that assumption. And then be very careful about this notion of black swans, right? Just because you've found one instance that works doesn't mean that all instances work, right? If you want to prove that all instances work, you must prove that there cannot possibly be an instance that doesn't work, right? So that's sort of a different thing. But anyways, logic, man. My point is just that make it small, right? Notice how I started by making this example. I started by saying that, oh, okay, but this class thing is, this attribute class is rendered into the component not just because of Vue, but rather because that's the way HTML works, right? Or HTML5. And then I was about to test that with another fake component that we constructed, and that's why we had that error where it was saying that, well, did you forget to register this component? But then I realized, well, okay, there's sort of too many parts here. We still have Vue loaded and all that. So in order for this to actually be a good test of what my claim was, so my claim was that HTML allows you to specify an arbitrary element, and HTML allows you to specify an arbitrary attribute, such as, for example, class, and class is just an arbitrary attribute. Then in order to do that, I need sort of a plain HTML page and not something that has to do with Vue, right? Because otherwise it might be that Vue actually fixes that for us, and then I conclude that, oh, I thought, I'm thinking it's because of HTML, but actually it's because of Vue. Okay, anyways, side note, but please don't underestimate the power of constructing, like forming a hypothesis and constructing a small test, executing that test, and then like clearly really learning something from that. Anyways, let's keep moving. So, but yeah, of course, I mean, even though what we just said, since they have this virtual DOM, right, which we've talked about in another episode, since Vue's actually parsing your template and keeping a in-memory representation of your DOM at all times, I guess, then it can still actually be true that they have an implementation that allows for class to be passed on. But maybe we could actually test that, right? Like if we add an arbitrary attribute which is foo, and then we set the value to bar, like is that passed on or is it not passed on? So if I now, let's see, that's on every cart item. So if we inspect a particular cart item, no, yes, okay, sorry, yes, it's here, right? So it seems like the implementation in Vue should probably be that, I mean, essentially they have an implementation for the directives that they know, and then as we talked about in the previous videos, they have special implementations for class, for bindings to class, and actually for bindings to style, which we haven't gotten to yet. But apart from that, it seems like if you're specifying some other arbitrary attribute, they'll just pass that through, right? Which makes like that seems like the best assumption that they can make, or not assumption, that's the best decision that they can make, right? Because then they're really enabling you to have a higher level of interoperability with other libraries, because it's difficult for them to foresee whatever libraries that you want to deal with, right? And so this kind of behaves like what we were saying with that you can say vbind and you can bind to foo, or like you can bind to any arbitrary attribute that you want, even though it doesn't really exist in HTML, but because in HTML you can have any attribute. Okay. We've ventured too far now. So the point is you can add classes like normal to components. Super cool. Okay, fine. But that's not the important point, right? The important point is that you can bind. So notice how I added this colon now, right? Shorthand syntax instead of saying v-bind colon class, right? So let's just say colon class. Then we are binding to the variable important. Actually, we don't have that. So what we're going to get is nothing, I guess. Yeah, so no classes. Okay. Haha. Actually, we didn't even get the class. We didn't even get the class, the word, like the attribute class here. So I'm wondering if I did something incorrect. Let's bind to something that does exist. Let's bind to, do we call it fname? Yeah, fname. Why didn't I call it first name? That is so strange. So we have an fname variable in scope. So can we bind to that? Yeah, okay. So it does work this way, right? So you can specify that you want to bind to class, and then you specify a variable that is in your scope at the point that you're currently at, or I mean from your data model, from your data object, or a computed property, or a method that you execute, and then you get the value that returns as a class. But again, that thing could return an object or an array. So you could use, as we've talked about before, you could use the array syntax, or you could use the object syntax. And notice here, when I'm saying the object syntax and the array syntax, I mean the special case of how Vue deals with when you pass an object as a value to to the class attribute on an element, right? So if I'm not talking about just objects generally or arrays generally, right? We're talking about objects and arrays in the context of rendering CSS classes for a Vue component or element. So essentially it behaves the same thing, right? It's like the same thing. And here they're showing, okay, cool, you can do class bindings. You can do bindings and you can pass these objects when we were saying. Same thing, when isActive is true, then the rendered HTML would be that the class will be rendered, so forth. Where did they get foo and bar from? Okay, so they have class bar. Yeah, okay, so they probably just skipped that. My component class. Yeah, okay, it seems like this example is in the documentation is a bit unclear because they probably missed to put class here as well, to put class Bazan as Bazan Boo. Foo bar. No, sorry. No. Ooh. Actually, this is important. This is very important. Sorry, my bad. This is not, I was confused. Their example is actually exact, right? The point is, notice how, I didn't really realize this, or I didn't think about this, but the class attribute is put on an li element. It's not put on, if we go to index.html, it's not put on a cart item element, right? Because there is no cart item element, because the cart item element is a component, and the template of that component, every template starts with a single element, right? Every component's template has a single root node. So like think about HTML. HTML is a tree. A DOM is always a tree, and a tree always has a root node. Just like in HTML, right? The root node is HTML, right? But in our component, the root node here in our template is li. Now, of course, we just happen to have a single element with some text inside of it. But you could have more stuff in that, right? Like we could have a span tag here, or like close that here, or like an image inside, or whatever. Like there could be all kinds of stuff inside of there. So there could be a tree inside that. But a template always starts with a single root. And the point is then that when we add a class, when we add classes to the component here, then those classes that we add will be added to the root element, because this sort of cart item element is not rendered, right? The cart item element is essentially just a way of saying that you want to have the root element and then all the stuff that's inside the root element, right? And again, like rendered through the actual properties that we happen to have, that we happen to pass to this particular instantiation of that component. I mean, you can think about cart item as a class. Now, I mean object-oriented class, not CSS class. So you can think about cart item as a class that's being instantiated, and when we instantiate it, we pass a single fruit from the list of fruits, right? That we give it as context, and then we set that fruit to the item property of that component, and that fruit or that item property we've specified here when we specify the view when we declare the existence of this view component. Then we specify that this thing takes props, and one of the props is the prop item. Let's jump back to index.html. So yeah, I mean, the interesting point is then, I guess, that we could add a class here and say, let's add important here, right? So here, when we are specifying cart item, we're specifying a regular old class, and then we're passing important. But then we're also we're binding a class, right? And that class is actually, let's say that we bind. We conditionally bind party if party mode is turned on, right? And then what we can do, there's one third place where we can add a class. Think about that, and I'll just let the cat in. Hang on. Okay, did you figure it out? So I mean, the third place that we can add a class to is at the root element inside the template of this particular cart item. I mean, of course, we could add it anywhere, but what I meant is that there are three ways of adding classes such that these classes will show up as CSS classes on the root element of the rendered component. So if we put class here, actually there are 4 ways then, because we could probably bind here as well. Let's try that out as well. So let's add a class here, and let's say, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of running out of classes, so maybe we should just be explicit, right? So let's say, yeah, let's do this, explicit inside, yeah, let's say explicit inside, right? And let's save that, and let's go back to index.html, and then let's add, let's change the conditional rendering of party here, and then let's say we'll just bind to a string, right? And we'll say a reactive outside, and then important we replace by reactive. No, sorry. We should say static rather than explicit, right? So static outside. So we have the static class outside. We have the reactive class outside. Then let's jump into main.js again, and let's change the template. And instead of explicit, we will say static. So we have static inside, and then let's try to do conditionally as well. Let's bind here. Let's say bind to class, and let's add a string, and then let's say reactive. Okay. Well, wait. We need to escape this string. So how am I going to do this? Yeah, I guess we can do that. Reactive inside, and then escape that. Oops, and then like that. Okay, so maybe we should try to break this up a bit. Oops. So like, yeah, that doesn't really work very well. Okay, so let me turn on wrapping for a moment. Sorry about the very ugly template. That should be figured out, but we're not going to figure that out now. Maybe we should figure out how to do that before we start to sort of rewrite the to-do application, or write the to-do application. Let's just try this out, right? I've saved that. Let's refresh this. Do we have any errors? No errors. Okay, so let's look at the classes that ended up on the root element, which is every li, right? Think about this. This li, and this li, those are all root elements of instances of a cart item component, right? So these are 3 sort of instances of the cart item component. So each of them are an individual cart item component. And you can see we actually have all the 4 classes: static inside, static outside, reactive inside, and reactive outside. Pretty cool, right? So instead of saying, instead of just binding to a string here, let's maybe change this. So let's bind to, yeah, but why not? Let's do that. Let's bind to party if party, right? So we'll add the class party if you are in party mode. So then you can see we now have 1, 2, 3 classes added only. But if we set party mode to true, then all of these 3 should turn red. And they did, right? And you can see we added the party class. Now the question then is, of course, can we do that from the inside as well? Clearly we should, of course, be able to do that. So let's remove that. Now we only have a static inside. We only have a class that's a static inside. And then, yeah, let's save that. Let's jump into main.js. And instead of just binding to a string here, reactive inside, we will bind to, yeah, same thing, an object where we say render the class party if party happens to be true. So again, remember last time, those 2 things are 2 different things. Like the key is actually the string, and the value is actually referring to the model property in our data model. That's being passed to the options object, or that's part of the options object that's being passed to the Vue instance. Let me refresh this. Okay, static inside and static outside. So now, of course, we don't have reactive inside because we removed that and replaced that by this party, and we didn't add the reactive outside, right? That thing we just removed. But now if I set party mode to true, we should still have red here. Aha, this didn't work, right? For a very important reason. Why didn't this work? Right? Namespacing. Or, I mean, it's not really namespacing. It's scope, right? So this is why you have props, right? This is actually like a fundamentally very, very important point. So I'm very glad we hit this place sort of very naturally, right? Since we haven't specified party as a props that's being passed down, we don't have access to the outer scope. I need to let the cat in, but just think about what that means. So think about that, right? I mean, it's like, this is the reason we have props. We have props so that we can think about, whoops, this is not going to work. We have props so that we don't have to think about, or so that we can think about components as either, I mean, depending on if you want to think about it as a function or as a class. But if you think about it as a class, you can think about a component that accepts attributes or accepts arguments in its constructor. And props are the arguments that it accepts in the constructor. Same thing, right? And if you write a class and then you write a function, a method, an instance method inside a class, then obviously that instance method does not have access to like the variables that are in scope outside of the class whenever so okay, let me put it this way. Whenever you instantiate a class, right? Like let's think about fake C#. Let's say you have an animal class, right? So you say animal cat is equal to new animal, right? We're pretending this is C#. And let's say I have an int here, right? Let's say int num is equal to 10, right? Inside animal, I of course don't have access to this number. I of course don't have access to num here, right? Because that then I could have access to anything that's like completely arbitrary. So because this depends completely on depends on the context in which you're instantiating animals. So that's not the way object orientation works, and of course, then this so like because like this might be in one file, and then you might have a completely different scenario where it's like you have a string that's the name that contains foo, and then you have this thing again in some other file, right? Like let's say this is some completely other location. Then like this, would this animal have access to some name, and this or like this animal has access to some string, and this animal has access to some number? No, this is like, that just doesn't make any sense. So what we do is that we pass data downwards into the animals, right? We pass this num into the animal, right? And if we want to be able to take both this number and this string, then of course we need to take two arguments, right? We need to pass everything down into the instance when we are instantiating the class. And the same thing goes for a function, right? I mean, if you have a function, yes, if you define, when you define the function, right? Let's say if we're now talking about JavaScript, if you have a name here, let's say John, right? Here you of course have access to, like when you're declaring the function, you of course have access to this name, yes, right? But that's not exactly what we're talking about. What we're talking about, if we draw this parallel with object orientation, is that if you define this function, let's say speak, as a function that takes no arguments, right? If I then, so let's say we've defined we define that function as returning name, and then I do this. Then I say, okay, var. Yeah, this is actually, because of hoisting, this is a bit tricky to exemplify. Let's say this. This is file 1, and this is file 2, right? And let's say that file 2 is actually importing. I'm thinking, okay, actually I could do some sort of like scoping or use of closures to sort this example out, but I think that's going to make it unnecessarily complicated. Let's just think about this as that there's this file 1 that constructs this this first function, and then there's this file 2 that constructs, that wants to use that speak function, right? So let's assume that it imports the speak function. Okay, and then let's say that here we have a variable called name that contains the string John, right? And then we want to say speak. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, of course that function, how could that function know that whenever the speak method is called, there must be something in scope called name, right? Like, that's not the way that functions work. Functions should sort of close over all of their data. It's like, well, if you want to have something that's name, of course, then that needs to be in that file, right? So that, like, well, the function, when it's being defined, knows about this thing called name. Or you simply pass in the name, right? You pass in the name here, and then you can return that, right? So maybe the implementation here would be hello, comma, plus the name, right? And then when you call speak, you pass the name, right? So these are sort of like not like literally the same thing, but like by parallel, or like roughly speaking exactly the same thing, right? It's like passing arguments to a function, or running or passing arguments to a constructor. You can actually, I like to think about constructors as partial application, but that's like as partial application as in currying, but that's a totally different discussion that's actually pretty interesting. But yeah, okay, so hopefully you can see how like none of those things like make any sense, and that's the reason why we can't do what I just did here, right? It's like spontaneously you might think that that's a reasonable thing to do, but actually if you start to sort of unravel why you can't do that, it's very, very fundamental, right? It's like you can't do that because of not, I don't want to say information hiding. There's another thing that I want to say. It's encapsulation, right? Because of encapsulation, because this thing can't just sort of go around and access all of these things outside itself by just making assumptions about what will exist, right? That's an extremely procedural paradigm, and I'm not even sure if you can do it in that way. Never mind, right? But that's it's a fundamental point, right? The view, a view component, or like generally a component. Whoops, let me. What did I do now? main, did I actually, no, sorry, okay, so, okay, terminal stuff. So a view component, or I guess like a component, is like a class, is like a function, and hence needs to take whatever dependencies it has as arguments. It can't just go around and access its outer scope because it has no idea about its outer scope because it wants to be reusable. So it can, so you have to simply specify its dependencies and then pass its dependencies down. Okay, so I think I've hammered that point in. So how do we do that? Well, then if we wanted to do this, right? If we wanted to specify this conditional rendering of the class party on the basis of party mode being true, then we have to pass that down as a prop. So let's specify this other prop here, and let's say in party mode. Or actually, yeah, let's say in party mode. Let's say in party mode, because that sort of exemplifies also another great point. So then we could say that this class is then that we will conditionally add the class party if the property in party mode happens to be true. Okay, so now we have to go back into index.html because now our instantiation, right, our calling of this, like our application of this function, right? Think about this. Like we have two pieces. When we're in main.js here and we're looking at the component, this is the declaration of the class or the declaration of the function. And when we are in index.html here, or like when we are in the parent component, then this is the function application, the calling of the function, or the instantiation of the class, depending on how you look at it, right? So what do we need to do here? Well, here, just like we passed, so actually let me turn on wrapping here as well. So, or actually, let's do this. Let's make a few line breaks like this. So just like we here passed in a value, we bound the variable fruit to the attribute item, which is a prop. We can also do that. We can bind to the attribute, yikes, what did I call it? In party mode. So maybe I should have called it like this, in party mode. Yeah, let's do that. So we bind it to in-party-mode. I use dashes because like it seems like that's sort of the conventional thing to do in HTML. And then we need to bind that to, well, what's the variable called in this scope? Well, in this scope, it's called a party, right? And so that's what I meant with wanting to emphasize another important point, which is that this idea of sort of passing things down as arguments also gives us a nice point of abstraction. That's not what I want to say. Another layer of indirection, right? Like every problem in computer science can be solved with another layer of indirection, except the problem of too many layers of indirection. Funny quote, right? But so we are binding to the variable party here, but then inside the model, inside the component, we can choose to call that thing that we that we bound to. We can decide to call that anything that we want. Just because we on the outside call it party doesn't mean that we have to on the inside call it party. Here we can call it something else, and here we are then calling it in party mode. So let me now change this sort of camel case to in-party-mode, right? Because that's what we named it here in index.html. Let me turn off wrapping again. So here, right? So we are binding, and here you can see this sort of indirection where we are saying take the variable party and bind that to the internal attribute, or like the local attribute, or the parameter of the function, and this parameter will be called in party mode. So it can usefully be thought of as function arguments. Okay. Let's save that and let's refresh and then let's look at this. I guess then if this works out, we should be able to toggle party mode on and off now. And we are, right? Importantly, not for the text up here, but for these list items, right? And this now happens because we've bound to the class. We've bound inside the template, right? We've bound to the class property inside the template of the component, and we've bound to a variable that we've passed in as a prop. So I mean, kudos to us. Much progress, many success. Yep, and I don't even know if they started to talk about that as well. No. So we are way ahead of schedule, man. They didn't really talk about that, right? Because that's probably what they'll talk about when they get to components. They simply talked about how you can bind on the outer level, right? But actually, I mean, yeah, maybe what I'm saying is a bit silly because you don't really need to say anything specific about that, because if you're in a template, like when you're in the template cart item, that's exactly the same thing as being inside this template, which is the root component. It's just that we're sort of talking about what happens in two different templates, right? But of course, it's the same logic that applies, but it's two different templates with two different data models, right? With two different scopes, right? There's access to different things. And actually, like, because it's hierarchical, it's like the cart item will have access to, actually not really, I mean, I was going to say that it will have access to some subscope, but that's not really true. It will have the model that cart item has access to is whatever we choose to pass down as properties, right? So it declares what it needs to accept as, or it declares what it accepts as properties, and then we pass stuff down through the properties. And when we're in the template, we apply the same logic that we've applied here when talking about how to use classes, right? And that's probably why they're not emphasizing that specifically, because it's the same thing, right? Like a template is a template, same stuff. But however, when you put the class attribute on a component here, right, on an instance of a component, or a function application of a component, or when you bind to the class attribute, that's a slightly different thing, right? Because then it won't end up on a element called cart item, for example. Like, it won't end up on a thing, on an element that's called the same thing as the component. It will end up on the root element of that component. Okay. I think we're going to cut this here. I thought we were going to get into inline styles. We're not going to get into inline styles, man. Next time, we'll talk about inline styles, and then we will sort of rewrite this application to a to-do application, and then we'll keep going forward. If you think that it's very important that we do rewrite to a to-do application first, let me know in the comments immediately, and then we will do that first. Otherwise, we'll get into inline styles in the next one. Thanks a ton for watching. If there's anything that you didn't appreciate with this video, please let me know in the comments so that I know how to improve for future videos. Otherwise, thanks a ton for watching. I'm glad to have you along, and I'll see you in the next one.